Howdy. Welcome to the Texas A&M University College of Veterinary Medicine and Biomedical Sciences Peer Programs STEM Education Series. Today, Dr. Jeffrey Musser will present bugs in your blood, malaria. Fever, chills, shaking, and an awful headache. Could you have malaria? Well, that's likely to depend on where you live. Dr. Musser will tell us where in the world malaria occurs, the history and pathology of the disease, as well as ways to prevent it. Welcome, Dr. Musser.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for being here with us, and good morning and good afternoon to our friends that are visiting with us from Ghana out in West Africa. So thank you for joining us. I'd like to spend these next 45 minutes in talking a little bit about malaria. I'm a veterinary surgeon, and malaria is a species-specific disease, meaning that the malaria that affects humans only affects humans. Malaria that affects birds only affects birds. And so for me, being a veterinarian, it's really interesting because some of my patients can get malaria, and also I can get malaria when I go to Ghana and visit Ghana, or go to Malawi, or go to these places, other places that have malaria. So let's go ahead and talk about malaria a little bit. Let's see if I can get this to work. All right, there we go. All right, so I always like to start off a little bit with what I'm trying to get across to you, some of my objectives. And what I hope that you'll take away from this talk is what causes malaria. And in medicine, we call that the etiology. The etiological agent is what causes the disease. Also, how do people get infected? That's called the transmission of the disease. What happens in an infected person? That's the pathogenesis. That's what the parasite or the organism does within your body. And so I wanted to talk about that. How to prevent from getting malaria. And of course, that would be prevention. But with that, we need to know a little bit about the life cycle of the parasite, of the organism causing the disease. We need to know a little bit about the clinical signs. I also would like for you to understand how malaria spreads across the world and how it did spread across the world. Some of the historical aspects of malaria and some of the present day role of malaria in the US and in the world. And I hope you'll just have some fun learning about malaria in itself. All right, who cares about malaria? Where is malaria? And so this is a map, and I really like maps because they help me to show myself and to show others where diseases are. And so we can see that there's the US and North America and South America. South America is in green. It has malaria, while the US and Canada does not have malaria. And if we look into the center, we can see Africa is right in the center of that map. And we can see that malaria is in Africa, and it's also in Asia. Malaria presently is not really in Europe. However, we're going to see that it was in Europe at one time, and it was in the US at one time. So why do we care about malaria? What is the impact of malaria? And malaria, there are about 350 to 5 million new clinical cases a year. That means 400 million people become infected with malaria each year. And each year, there's between 500,000 and 1 million deaths due to malaria. I mean, that's 1 million people dying from this disease. Now, of those people, about 75% are children under the age of 5. In 2015, there were about 300,000 children less than the age of 5 that died. And so you can see the impact of malaria is big. Not just the human toll, people who get infected and die, but also think about when you get sick or when your mom and dad get sick, what that does. They can't go to work, so money sometimes is a problem. You couldn't go to school, so education becomes a problem. So the impact of malaria is not just who dies, not just who gets infected, not just the cost of medicines and hospitalization, but it also impacts a cost on your learning and the well-being of a country. Well, for our friends in Ghana, this is a map of West Africa, and Ghana is right in the center, right along the ocean there. And let me increase that a little bit. And hopefully you can see there's Ghana right in the center. Now, what is the impact of malaria in Ghana? Malaria is endemic in Ghana. I'm going to be using some of the words that we use in medicine because I think it's important for you also to understand these words and to know these words. And there's words like endemic, epidemic. Well, endemic means that the disease is always there. It's there at some level. And so malaria is present in Ghana always at some level. And depending on which literature I went to, there's about 3 million to 9 million new clinical cases a year in Ghana. Think of that, 3 million people. That's like the population of Dallas and Houston becoming infected with malaria every year. That's just, to me, is staggering. And of those people that get infected, 2,000 are children that die. And so 2,000 children die a year from malaria. And 25% of those children are below the age of 5. So you can see the impact of malaria. And my friends that are in malaria, you know the impact. You live the impact of malaria. All right, so let's talk about malaria itself. What is malaria? Well, malaria is a microscopic organism. And so since it's a microscopic organism, we'll need a microscope to see it. And that's what I have pictured here is I have a microscope with two eyepieces on it. And so if we put a slide there on the microscope and we have those two eyepieces there and we adjust it so that we make one image and then we magnify it a little bit, what we have here is we have a picture of blood. So we put a slide on this microscope of red blood cells. And that's what you're seeing here, right in the center, those big purple cells. There's actually 3 of them that I can see. Right? Thank you very much. They're right there. There's 4 of them there, yes. Those are white blood cells. Those are the blood cells that are part of the immune system. But up at the top of this picture, we can see at the edge of the red arrows, that's a red blood cell, and that little purple dot right there in the center. And if we go to the other arrow, just down from it, the cell just down from it, go down just a little bit, you can see there's the purple. That is the malaria parasite that's in the red blood cell. And so already we've learned a little bit about malaria. We learned that it's a microscopic organism. It's a parasite. It's not a bacteria. It's not a virus. It's not a fungi, but it's a parasite. And we'll learn more about that. And it infects red blood cells. So another picture of malaria. But what we have here is malaria is the term, the name of the malaria organism is a Plasmodium. And that's the genus name of it. And Plasmodium, these Plasmodiums, these parasites, will attach and then they enter into the red blood cell. And what we'll be looking at here is we'll be looking at a little video of this happening. So right in the center we have the red blood cells, and you can see the cell off to the left has a little parasite, and that's what's bouncing around there. Those are the Plasmodium parasites. And the one in the center is trying to get in the cell, get in that red blood cell. And if you watch those two cells, watch the one on the left is already now going into the red blood cell. It's entering it. Oh, the one in the center has attached. And look at that. It's going into the red blood cell. And so the parasite attaches to that red blood cell and then gets inside the red blood cell. Thank you very much. And so what does it do when it gets inside the red blood cell? Well, parasites only want to be in there. All they want to do is eat and reproduce. That's all they want to do. And so when that parasite, when that Plasmodium enters inside the red blood cell, it starts to multiply in that red blood cell. And what it'll do is it'll keep multiplying and multiplying and multiplying until it fills up that red blood cell and it bursts out of it. And it bursts out, and then those Plasmodiums, there's more of them in the circulatory system, in the bloodstream, and they are able to infect other red blood cells. We'll talk a little bit more of that too. Here are the 4 species. So Plasmodium is the genus. That's the Latin name of the malaria organism. And then there's different species. And so there's a Plasmodium falciparum. And Plasmodium falciparum is the killer of man. It is the malaria that will kill man. And in Ghana, Plasmodium falciparum is the predominant. It's the #1 malaria organism that's present. Plasmodium falciparum also causes cerebral malaria. What Plasmodium falciparum does is when it gets inside a person's body, it will cause the red blood cells to become sticky. And so when those red blood cells become sticky, you get a clot. You get a blood clot inside the vein or inside the artery. And those little blood clots will keep moving until they lodge into a small artery, an arteriole, into a small vessel, and they'll block it. Well, if they block it, it means no more red blood cells are going past there. Well, if there's no more red blood cells going past there, remember, red blood cells have oxygen, and so there's no oxygen getting to the tissue past that blockage. Now, if that blockage is in the tip of my pinky and there's a little bit of death, it's not that big of a problem. But if that blockage is in somewhere inside my brain and then red blood cells cannot get to brain tissue and that brain tissue dies, that's a big deal. And that actually can kill us or incapacitate us. It can make it so that we lose our brain function. And so we are, in essence, can become a vegetable that we cannot move, we cannot think. And that's called cerebral malaria. Oh, one thing I'd like to say is that if there's any questions, please go ahead and ask them, because I would love to have a discussion. This is, it's a little more difficult for me to see you guys, but if you've got questions that come up, please send them to Tori and we can address them, or if we're going to talk about them later in the talk, I'll tell you about that. So really, anything you want to interact with me, please do.
You actually already have a question.
There we go.
They want to know, are there some types of red blood cells that are more or less susceptible to malaria, such as sickle cell anemia?
Oh, good question. Okay. The red blood cells that are in us are really pretty much the same. And so the Plasmodium, the malaria parasite, will attach, and when it attaches to the red blood cell, it then goes inside of it. And this will happen to pretty much all the red blood cells. Sickle cell anemia is a little bit different. There's something called the sickle cell trait. And the reason it's called a sickle cell trait is because it makes that red blood cell sickle up. It changes its shape. And so what happens is the malaria parasite gets into a red blood cell. And if that red blood cell has the genetic makeup, the chromosomes, for the sickle cell trait, then what will happen is that red blood cell, which is like a donut shape, it's rounded and it's pushed in the center, the parasite will get into it, it'll cause that red blood cell to sickle in shape. Well, red blood cells that have abnormal shapes are eaten by the spleen. And so that's how that sickle cell trait protects people, and especially in West Africa, where there's a lot of the sickle cell trait, is that it protects them. They still get infected from malaria, but when the malaria gets into the red blood cell, it changes its shape, and the body can destroy that red blood cell and the parasite. So all red blood cells can be infected with that malaria parasite. Good question, though. Okay, so let's finish up. We talked about Plasmodium falciparum. Let's talk about Plasmodium malariae. All right, that is one of the subtropics. That was a malaria that was in Europe, was in the United States. It was in Southeast Asia during the Vietnam conflict. It's where our military, is the malaria that our military was affected with, had to worry about. And then there is Plasmodium vivax and ovale. And I could sit here and talk with you all for hours about malaria. And yes, I can see some of you all groaning and going, oh gosh, no, please. Well, I won't go that long into it. But Plasmodium vivax and ovale are interesting, is that we'll see there is a life cycle. Remember I talked about that? Is they will have a stage that stays in the liver. And so it's very, very hard for the body to get rid of that parasite, and it's very hard for drugs to fight against those two parasites. So that's just the 4 that affect humans. None of those 4 affect birds that I work with. Birds do get malaria, but it's species specific. It will only affect a certain species. So the malaria that affects humans only affects humans. The malaria that affects birds only affects birds. All right, so let's talk about the history a little bit. A little brief on the history of malaria. Malaria is really, it predates history. It has infected man for all our history. Everything that we know malaria has been with us. Malaria most likely originated in Africa, and then it followed the human migration out of Africa. And there are some theories that malaria evolved and first came from animals into humans in West Africa, in places around Ghana, Nigeria, the Ivory Coast, in those areas. That's where malaria probably originated from. And so malaria was in Africa, and this is a map of the world, Africa being right in the center. And so that's where it originated. And then as human migration went out of Africa, then people that had malaria moved, and they took malaria with them because they were infected with malaria. And as they migrated, the malaria went with them. And the mosquitoes, we're already jumping ahead a little bit. Mosquitoes are part of this life cycle. The mosquitoes were there, which could transmit the malaria from one person to another person. So in the history, there are some writings from China. They were dated around 2700 BC. And those writings are called the Nixing. And in the Nixing, they talk about the 3 demons. They don't talk about malaria because the germ theory, the idea, the knowledge that parasites and viruses and bacteria cause disease really only came about in the 1880s, about 130 years ago. So when you start reading literature from before then, they didn't really know what malaria was, but they knew about these three demons. And what we believe is these three demons in the Nishing, they were talking about malaria. Because those three demons, one demon was of great cold, the intense shivering. And this is what you get when you get malaria, as you get this cold and you start to shiver. And I have worked in Malawi and my colleagues have had malaria. And when they start to shiver, their whole bed starts to shake. And then after the shivering, there's a fever. And so there's the demon of fever. And that fever is up to 106 degrees Fahrenheit. And there's a great thirst. And 106 degrees is not very conducive to life. I mean, it is a high fever. And then there's these massive headaches that occur. And so there was the demon of the headaches, the three demons of chills, fevers, and headaches. And so what we believe is we believe that in this book, the Nishing, that they were talking about malaria. And that's what happens. When you get infected, you get the chills, the great cold, the fever, the massive headaches. And that lasts for about 6 hours. And then those signs break, those clinical signs break, and everything, you become relatively normal. You feel normal. And then about 48 to 72 hours later, depending on the species of malaria, these clinical signs, the great cold, the fever, the massive headaches, come again. And they will last 6 hours, and then they will go away. And then 48 to 72 hours, they will come again. So they were intermittent. And that's the name of malaria that's the name given to malaria in the 1700s and the early 1800s is intermittent fever, because there was a fever for 6 hours, and then there wasn't for 48 to 72 hours. And then fever, and then there wasn't. And this is what we see when people get infected with malaria.
You have another question, Dr.
Yes.
Musser. So they want to know, assuming that malaria doesn't kill you, how long does the cycle go on, the fever and no fever cycle?
These are great questions. It goes on until your body's immune system can win the battle. This is a battle between these organisms, these parasites, and us, our bodies. And you're correct, you're absolutely correct, is that if you don't die, you must get better. And so these clinical signs, these adverse clinical signs, can last for weeks. And usually we're looking at somewhere between 7 days and 14 days. Those are the real bad clinical signs. Now, this will last for a long time. And so you will be weak. If you think about it, these parasites attack the red blood cells. And when they attack the red blood cells, they burst them, and so you become anemic. Your amount of red blood cells in your body drops. And so since you don't have the red blood cells for the oxygen, you get very lethargic. You get very weak. And so it can be so bad that me just getting up and going here and walking over to Tori might be the only thing I can do during that day. That's how weak I am. So it will take months for you to get over that weakness. Now, the bad part of it is that you can become reinfected with malaria. And so your body can fight it off, but there isn't 100% immunity. So you're not protected from getting infected again. But if you get infected every year, or as we know it's endemic in Ghana, then what happens is you develop a protective mechanism, a partial immunity, so that when you're infected, you don't get those really bad chills, or if you do, it only lasts for a short period. And so you don't get the virulent, the very bad form because of that protection. But those of us in the United States, most of us have never had malaria. So if we get infected with the parasite, we will have very bad clinical signs. Those clinical signs can last 7, 14, 4 weeks. They can last a month or longer, and then we are going to be so weak for a long, long time. This is if we don't take medicines, which there are medicines, and that's for another talk. But there are medicines that we can take to fight against the malaria if we get it. Thank you for that question. So back to the intermittent fever and back to the history is, remember I said there were different names for malaria. One was intermittent fever. Well, the thought was, how did this come about? How did this disease come about? And there was a theory called the miasma theory. And miasma was, there was these gases, these airs, these malairs, malaria, these bad airs that could cause diseases in people. And a lot of it came from the swamps, because swamps can have a foul smell. They can smell a little bit like rotten eggs. And what people saw is that there was malaria around swamps. And so the idea was these poisonous airs, these poisonous vapors, were what was causing the malaria. And that's caused the miasma theory. And that miasma theory was that was for a lot of disease that theory was put into play for. But as we know, there's really no poisonous airs that are exhaled from the swamps. It's just that there were mosquitoes around the swamps to infect people. So malaria, we said, was in Africa, and it spread throughout Africa and then spread throughout Europe and Asia with the migration of people. And that's what we have here. The map in the red is where malaria is located. And so it was in Europe. We're looking at about 1490 right now, the year 1490. And so, but we can see to the left-hand side, North and South America, there was no malaria prior to 1492. And so, what happened in 1492? We said prior to 1492. Correct. In 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. And this was the age of European exploration. And so Columbus and the Europeans that were exploring it came from the seaports. And it's a little hard to see there, but right in the center, just above Africa, is Spain and France and Italy and England. And they had malaria. So the people that had malaria were on the boats, and they brought it over to the Americas. And so the people came, the mosquitoes that were in the Americas bit the people with the parasite. They got the mosquitoes got the parasite, and then they spread it. And then also we know there was the slave trade that happened right in the 15 and 1600s. And that slave trade came from West Africa. And you can see that's all in red. There's malaria there. And so there was another wave, another way for malaria to get into the Americas, and that was with the slave trade. So malaria came in from Europe and came in from Africa. And it wasn't in the Americas prior to the exploration, the European exploration, prior to 1492. So 1492, malaria came into the Americas, and then it spread, and it's one of the diseases that helped to wipe out 90% of the Native Americans that were in the area. It was because the people in the Americas had never seen it before, just as we were talking about, they had a very bad case of malaria and actually killed a lot of them. But malaria, yellow fever, smallpox, those diseases which weren't in the Americas were introduced into the Americas inadvertently from people coming in and exploring, and those diseases were the ones that were the cause of killing a lot of Native Americans. So malaria spread throughout the Americas. And this is a map here of the US, and it's around 1850. And again, in the red is where malaria is located. And you see malaria is all on the eastern coast. That's to the right. It's down in through Texas, which is in the bottom center. And it's up on the west coast where California is. And so in 1912, 60 years later, it's still in those general areas, but it decreases a little bit. It's not as much in the northern states, but it's in the southern states. So we did have malaria throughout the US, but then it starts to decrease. And we're going to talk a little bit of why it's decreased and why we don't have it. But in 1912, about 100 years ago, there were about 130,000 people infected and 4,000 deaths each year in the Americas. In Texas alone, there were 25,000 cases of malaria a year. And 1% to 3% of the deaths were due to malaria. So you can see malaria was a big problem in the US, and especially in the southern parts of the US. Now in the US, we really don't have a malaria problem. We have roughly 2,000 cases each year. Now, interesting about those cases are not caused from the mosquitoes in the United States. Malaria is not endemic in the US. It is brought in. It's from people who go outside of the US, go traveling to South America, Asia, Africa, get infected there, and then come back into the United States. And because of our health system, we have a very good health system here in the US. Because of it, only 0 to 5 deaths a year due to malaria. Put this in perspective. Flu. We have flu that comes through every year in the US. There are roughly 3 to 50,000 people die each year due to flu. So you can see flu is more of a problem in the US than malaria. But malaria is a global problem. It is a worldwide problem. So let's talk a little bit about the life cycle. All right, I've alluded to it. At first, prior to 1876, we knew there were 3 demons: the chills, fever, and headaches. And that's pretty much all we knew. And then in 1876, there was a French physician named Charles Laveran, and he was stationed in Algeria. And he was very interested in malaria because a lot of the military, the French military in Algeria, were infected with malaria and affected by malaria. And what did he do? Well, he took a microscope and he started looking at the blood of people that were infected or affected with malaria. And what did he see? He saw these red blood cells with those parasites. You've seen these before. Right in the center, there's a good red blood cell that has the parasite in it. And what he found is that people that didn't have this parasite didn't have malaria. People that had this parasite in their red blood cells had malaria, were affected from it. And so he found that it was this single cell, it's called a protozoan parasite. This single-celled organism, this protozoan, is what caused malaria. And there are the 4 plasmodiums that we talked about. So protozoan is the name of the parasite. It's a single-celled organism. Plasmodium is the genus. It's the Latin name of the malaria organism that infects animals. So in 1880, we knew that there was a protozoan parasite. We also knew there were chills and fevers, but that's about all we knew about the life cycle. So how was it spread from person to person? How did this parasite, how did this protozoan go from person to person? Well, in 1897, there was another military physician. His name was Sir Ronald. At that time, it was Ronald Ross. It wasn't Sir Ronald Ross. But what he did is he was stationed in India, And he found that the malaria protozoan was in the stomach of Anopheles mosquitoes, so of mosquitoes. And what he did is he did some really interesting experiments to take the mosquitoes and had the mosquitoes feed upon animals that had malaria. And then he would look at the mosquitoes. Well, the malaria takes some time to develop in the mosquitoes. And so he wouldn't see them the first day, the second day, the third day. But what he did is he had some that had lasted 7 days, 10 days. And he was looking at the stomach of mosquitoes. Think about it. He's there dissecting out mosquitoes and looking in the stomach of mosquitoes for this microscopic organism. And what he found in the stomach of mosquitoes, as he put it, clear and almost perfectly circular outline. Another and another exactly similar cell. Here was the clue. The mosquito itself had become infected with the malaria parasite. And so with that, we knew that the malaria parasite was a protozoan that was in the blood, and that mosquitoes that bit people got infected with malaria. And then there were a lot of more studies done, but then we had found that the mosquito also bit people and reinfected people. And so this is the simple life cycle of that. Now that mosquito, again, I talked about terms. That mosquito would be a vector in the life cycle of malaria. And a vector is an organism, such as an insect or a rodent, that transmits a pathogen. And so the mosquito is the vector for malaria. The mosquito is the vector for West Nile virus, which we've heard about, I'm sure. The flea could be a vector for bubonic plague. The flea can pass it from rodent to rodent, from rat to rat, and then jump off the rat and bite us and give us the plague. So there are many types of vectors. But in malaria, the mosquito, the Anopheles mosquito, is the vector. And so that's how it's transmitted by the Anopheles mosquito, from the bite of the Anopheles mosquito. I like life cycles because it helps me put everything into perspective. And so here's a life cycle of the malaria parasite. And where I started is I started that it's in the body. And so, Tori, can you help me out here? At the bottom is a mosquito biting a person. And that mosquito has the parasite. And that parasite gets into the body. It then gets into the blood stream, the circulatory system, and it goes into the liver. In the liver, it will stay for about 3 weeks while it goes through reproduction, so while it makes more malaria. It will burst out of the liver cell into the circulatory system, into the bloodstream, and then it will look for red blood cells. When it finds a red blood cell, you've seen the video, it attaches, it gets into the red blood cell, it goes through a reproductive cycle, it produces more of the parasite in there, and then it bursts out of the red blood cell, and then those parasites can infect other red blood cells. And so again, thinking about the clinical sign of anemia, you can see how this parasite destroys the red blood cells in a person's body. Well, now let's see how the mosquito gets, oops, sorry about that. Let's see if we can move up again. There we go. So let's see if we can figure out how the mosquito gets infected. So a person is infected with the parasite. A mosquito, the Anopheles mosquito, bites a person with it. They take a blood meal, and it's the female mosquito that takes a blood meal because she needs that protein for eggs. And so the female mosquito bites a person that's infected, takes a blood meal. That parasite reproduces in the gut of the mosquito. Sir Ronald Ross found that out. Then it will migrate up to the salivary gland, and then that mosquito has the parasite in the salivary gland. So when it bites a new person to get a blood meal, if that person isn't infected, that person will become infected.
we have another question.
Yes.
And this one is kind of about malaria, but kind of about vectors as well. They'd like to know, can mosquitoes carry and transmit more than one disease at a time? Like you mentioned that mosquitoes transmit West Nile virus, and they transmit some other things as well.
They can. Now, the thing about mosquitoes is there's a lot of different types of mosquitoes. There's a lot of different genus and species. And so the Plasmodium genus, Plasmodium falciparum, Plasmodium malariae, those are transmitted by the Anopheles mosquito. The Anopheles mosquito we have here in the U.S. is not a great transmitter of the parasite. The Anopheles mosquito, I believe it's the Anopheles gaminensia, I believe it is, which is in West Africa, is a very good transmitter of the parasite. Not all diseases go through the Anopheles mosquito. The West Nile virus, it's a different type of mosquito that gets infected with the West Nile virus. So it depends on the disease on which mosquito it will be transmitted with, which mosquito is the vector for it. But some diseases do use the same vector. And so you can, if you're really unlucky, get infected with two diseases from one mosquito. Highly unlikely, but still possible. Great question. Okay, so let's go into the malaria life cycle real quick again. This is one I had. No, it looks a little busy, but there's a person right in the center, and to the left is the mosquito part of the life cycle, and to the right is the human part of the life cycle. And remember, we said that the parasite bursts out of the red blood cells down there at the bottom right-hand side. And that's when you start seeing the demons. That's when you start seeing the clinical signs. And so those clinical signs are because the red blood cells are bursting and the parasite is going out. Now, the reason I put this life cycle up is because it also tells us how can we break the life cycle. Well, if a mosquito can't bite us, then the mosquito can't give us the parasite. If the mosquito can't bite us, the mosquito can't get the parasite. And if we don't have the parasite, then even if a mosquito bites us, it can't get the parasite because we don't have it. And so that means the vector is very important, but also the reservoir, where the parasite resides in a human, is very important. And so we have a reservoir, just like a reservoir of water holds something. In biology, a reservoir is where the disease is, and it's where the mosquito gets the parasite. The vector is what transmits the parasite. We know it's the Anopheles mosquito. And then the host is the animal that gets the disease. Well, we've already said that this is a host-specific. So what we want to do is reduce the reservoir, which would be us. Reduce the host. Well, we can't reduce the host because we're not going to get rid of us, right? But if we reduce people that have the disease and reduce contact with the vector, then that will help to reduce malaria in an environment. And that's what happened in the United States. We reduced contact to the vector and the reservoir. And how did we do that? Okay, contact with vector. If we wear long clothes, if we wear clothes that have insecticides on them, that will reduce our contact with the vector. If we wear insecticides like off, that will reduce the contact with the vector. If we have screens in our windows, that'll keep the mosquitoes from getting in the house, reduce contact of the vector. You can also sleep under bed nets. My friends in Ghana have probably seen these. That I have slept in these when I was out working in Africa, because these mosquitoes are at dawn and dusk. And so if I'm underneath a bed net, then I am protected from the mosquito, So I won't get the disease, and if there's someone with the disease and sleeping underneath that bed net, they won't give the disease to the mosquito. Reduce the reservoir. Remember, it's people that are the reservoir. Well, one of the things about the reservoir is we want to keep people from getting bit by mosquitoes that have the parasite. So one of the ways is to reduce contact with the vector. There's lots of ways that you can reduce this vector. And this is a little chart that I got off the internet about preventing malaria. And you can do this. You can find these anytime you need to. So this is how we reduced malaria from being in the U.S. to not being in the U.S. It's not endemic. In Ghana, they are working on this right now. The amount of malaria has been reduced in Ghana. It's still endemic, but it is reduced quite a bit. All right. Remember that in the U.S. we've reduced it so much that we really don't see malaria. It's not endemic in the U.S. anymore. So I'd like to end here. As I said, I could continue to talk, but hopefully now that you know a little bit and what causes malaria, how people get infected, what happens when they're infected, how to prevent from getting malaria, and a little bit about the history and how it spread around the world. And I hope you've had a little bit of fun learning with me about this. So remember, the major thing is protect yourself. All right? Thank you all very much. And if the teachers out there are interested in further information, we can send that to them. I have informational material here at the end of this PowerPoint, and it will be available because there's a lot of good information out there. With that, I want to thank you all very much.
All right, we have a couple of questions two from Lee High School. The first one is they want to know how long is the death of the mosquito after infecting someone with malaria? So how long before the mosquito dies? How many people can that mosquito infect before it's gone?
Mosquito life cycle is really interesting. Mosquitoes, depending on the environment, can live either 1 month or sometimes up to 6 months. That mosquito can, every time, if it's infected, every time it bites a person, it can pass it. Mosquitoes bite a person roughly every 21 days to get a blood meal. So you can see in a 6-month period, they could infect a lot of people with that parasite. Here in Texas, some of our mosquitoes will actually live through the winter down in the sewers too. So it very much depends. Let me say one of the things that with spraying, and I know they're doing this in Ghana and they're doing it in Africa, is you can also spray the inside of houses in the walls, because that mosquito, when it bites you, it goes up and it hides up in the top of the ceiling. And so the insecticide up there can kill the mosquito. So there's treatment inside the houses also.
All right, and then the next question is the vaccine for malaria that was developed in 2015. How successful has it been, especially for people in underdeveloped countries?
Very good. I see somebody has done a little bit of reading about malaria. There is a new vaccine, and it shows good potential. It is in what there are stages that you go through to test it, and it is in the later stages. And I believe, if I remember correctly, it will be tested in Ghana, Malawi, and Kenya. It seems to be pretty good. It reduces the amount of people that die, or about children that die, by about 50%. It doesn't cover everybody. It doesn't stop the disease, but it reduces the amount of people that die. And remember, children under 5 are the biggest problem. So it has potential, but we still have a lot to do. Prevention, keeping yourself protected away from the mosquitoes, is the #1 thing that anyone can do to reduce malaria.
All right. Well, that is about as much time as we have today, so we'll have to wrap up for today. But like Dr. Musser was saying, if you'd like to learn more about malaria, let us know, send us an email, and we'll be sure to get that information to you. If you'd like to learn more about other STEM topics or veterinary science, we encourage you to log into the PEER website, peer.tamu.edu. And we look forward to seeing you next week when Dr. Mays talks to us about how to prepare for veterinary school. Y'all have a great day, and we'll see you next time.